All right, welcome back. Today we're going to be starting our series on ancient Greece and really shifting gears where we begin to talk more exclusively about Western civilization. So far we've talked about Egyptian civilization, we've talked about China, we've talked about India, we've talked about Mesopotamia. But from now on, at least in our time that we're going to be spending on ancient civilization, we'll be focusing on the West. And the West today is usually thought of as Europe and the countries or continents that were settled by Europeans during the Age of Explorations. But it was Western civilization can be thought of as three layers that are cast over each other. So you have the Greco-Roman layer, and from that you get the philosophical and especially the political concepts that come out of Greco-Roman culture. You can think of specifically the idea of the citizen that comes to us from those cultures. You also have Christianity, that I would say is the largest and most influential of the layers, and then you also have Germanic culture. So the interplay between these three sets of ideas, the Greco-Roman, the Christian, and the Germanic, are what have created what we today call Western civilization, and that's what we're going to be focusing on from now on. Like I said, as far as our time spent in ancient history goes. Now, ancient history can be thought of as the beginning of history, the beginning of written records, because that's what history is, all the way up to the fall of the Roman Empire. And we've used timestamps from Greece and Rome as we've talked about other civilizations. So, for example, when Alexander the Great conquered Egypt or Persia, things like that, we've talked about Greece and Rome as kind of a way of making a touchstone for where we are in history with regard to some of these other places. But from now on, we're going to be focusing on those civilizations themselves. So starting with Greece. And Greece today would be the southern part of the Balkan Peninsula. You can see the Mediterranean Sea here. And then you have these two peninsulas that come out and kind of reach out and touch each other, or almost touch each other. You have the Anatolian Peninsula, that would be Turkey today, and the Balkan Peninsula. The southern part of that would be what we would today call Greece. And two civilizations, two cultures that spring up on that in that area are first the Minoan civilization. This is the first civilization to spring up in Europe. It is a Bronze Age civilization. Not a ton is known about it. We know their aesthetic, we know their architecture. Interestingly enough, one of the facts that we know about it is this is where we get the myth of the Minotaur. So the Minoan civilization and the Minotaur being the myth of the half man, half bull that is slain in the labyrinth. But the Minoan civilization has actually a couple of different rises and falls, due partially to what most people would say is probably volcanic activity. But we have another civilization that springs up on the mainland of Greece, and that would be what's called Mycenaean civilization. Mycenaean civilization kind of winds up taking over and becoming a lot larger and broader and even conquering Minoan civilization. But you'll notice the aesthetic that we have here, the architecture, the way that people would have been described to have dressed is very similar. They also have their own distinct alphabets. The Minoans had what's called Linear A, and the Mycenaeans had Linear B, that were probably being used to write something that was akin to the Greek language at the time, but neither of these have actually been deciphered at this time. But these are both Bronze Age civilizations, and one thing that we've talked about before, and then we know what happens with the Bronze Age, is that it ends very suddenly, very abruptly, by a group of people that are sometimes called the Sea People. The Sea People are settlers, refugees, Vikings. They're not actually Vikings, but they're similar to Vikings in that they're seafaring conquerors who come in from places to the west, perhaps Sardinia, Sicily, maybe mainland Italy, what today would be Italy, the Apennine Peninsula, but we don't actually know. And one interesting theory that I like, and might even believe in to a degree, is that some of the Sea Peoples were themselves Greeks, because we see that these Sea Peoples move into Mycenaean Greece. They move into Egypt, they move into the Levant, Anatolia, and they disrupt the systems of power, the centralized authorities that are there at the time. So, the Mycenaean civilization or centralized power structure is completely disrupted at this point, and Greeks of different dialects and different backgrounds, different kind of sub-ethnicities are scrambled and scattered across the islands and across the Aegean Sea, and they wind up finding kind of settling new homelands. Because those homelands are now available, because that power is now decentralized. And so you have the Dorian Greeks, the Aeolian, the Ionian Greeks. They kind of, all these different speakers of different Greek dialects, they scramble around, and they settle into new city-states. And this at the end of the Mycenaean Empire, the end of the Bronze Age, this launches what would be what's called the Greek Dark Age. And it's a dark age because we don't have a lot of information on it, but what we do see coming out the other side of that dark age is that we see that these different types of Greeks have settled into different city-states. And the city-state is the principal unit of political organization in Greece. So when we think of Persia, we think of there being all of these different areas that Persia conquered, and there's one king of Persia who's also the king of all of those conquered areas, from Egypt to Anatolia to India even, right? All of those people are ruled over by one centralized authority. Same thing with Egypt and the pharaoh over the Egyptian empire. Same thing largely with Assyria. That's how we have thought of history up to this point. But decentralization is one of the distinctives of the Greeks. So you have a city and the surrounding countryside, the estate. This would be the city-state. So some of these cities that are perhaps more well-known would be like Thebes, Athens, Sparta, Corinth. But then those cities would be surrounded by an estate, by land that would be farmed and kind of loyal to that chief city. So for Athens, the city-state, the surrounding state that Athens would have been, you can think of it as the capital of, would have been Attica. For Sparta, it would have been Laconia. And you have these different city-states that, while they are distinct from each other, and while a lot of them had rivalries, they also thought of themselves as being Greek in common. And so that's what I want to use this lecture to really talk about, is what does it mean to be Greek? Because the Macedonians might have hated the Trojans. The Ephesians might have hated the people who lived in Thebes. However, they did all share a common culture. And so what did it mean? What are the things that united these people as far as thinking of themselves as Greek? One of the things would have been the aesthetic. We see that they borrow heavily from the Minoan and the Mycenaean aesthetics. The architecture, the pottery, the style of clothing that's described and also preserved for us through different statues. One thing that I kind of joke about is this disdain for pants. They thought of civilized peoples as being people who did not wear pants. So the Greeks themselves, the Egyptians, the Persians, but then if you went further north to where the real barbarians were from, and you encountered maybe the Slavic, Proto-Slavic tribes or Proto-Germanic tribes, those people wore pants, and they were thought of as, just being backwards, half-animal people. So the aesthetic, like I said, that's a really helpful way of kind of being able to understand where one civilization or culture begins and another ends, is the Greek aesthetic, and this is something that we're all familiar with. Another thing, obviously, would be the Greek language. The Greek language had its alphabet that they had taken actually from the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were another seafaring people of the Mediterranean, not ethnically or linguistically or religiously related. However, their alphabet that they had come up with was so useful that the Greeks actually adopted it and just assigned those letters to the sounds that were used by the Greeks in their own language. This would have been the language that famous epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey were written in. Also, significantly, it's the language that became the language that was used for the writing of the Christian New Testament of the Bible. Because of that, because there were so many people for centuries to come after that who were familiar with the Greek language because of their, familiarity with Christianity, this is one of the things that kept Greek literature, Greek writing, Greek playwrights, their writings alive, was the fact that you had this group of people who were familiar with the Greek language because of their proximity to Christianity. So you have the aesthetic, you have the Greek language. Another thing would be this type of social organization in the polis. Polis is the Greek word for city, and so even today we have places like Minneapolis or Annapolis, Maryland. These are places, that you have these polises would have been the walled city of a specific region, and those places would have had things that were that would have stood out about them. So, for example, you have the Acropolis. Acro means up high, so you can think of like an acrobat. The Acropolis was the highest part of the city. That's usually where you would have a temple that would be dedicated to that city's patron god or goddess. So, for Athens, you can imagine it was Athena, right? And so the temple of Athena would have been up top on the Acropolis overlooking the rest of the city. You also have what's called a gymnasium. Gymno, interestingly enough, is the prefix that means naked, and this is a place where men would have trained naked for combat, for the Olympics, for whatever they were doing, because they thought that any type of clothing that they might wear might give them an advantage, and they were also worshippers of the human form, and so because of that, because they were focused on their health, their virility, their vitality, they were also trying to put their bodies on display in the gymnasium. You would have a theater or an amphitheater where different plays could have been performed, things like that. And then the houses of a lot of the more wealthy people would have been inside of the polis because it was a more well-defended place. You have a wall that's built around all of these different polises. And then in the center of the city, what I want to call your attention to is a place that's called the agora. The agora is the marketplace, and it would have been like the beating heart of the city. You can think of it almost like a farmer's market type of area. So if you were a fisherman, you would go out and fish, and then you would bring your fish to the agora. If you were a farmer, you would harvest your vegetables, and then you would bring a certain amount of them, what you had harvested every day, to the agora, and that's where people would sell things, and that's where people would buy things for use for consumption throughout the day, or even things like jewelry or clothing or things like that. And because of that, because the agora was such a frequently visited, considered a public space, this is where a lot of public discourse happened. A lot of philosophizing also happened inside of the agora. So we'll talk about Greek philosophy later and how a lot of those philosophers spoke in the agora because that's where people were gathered. But it's also where public discourse and where political activity would have taken place. One thing that we associate with the Greeks is this idea of democracy. And democracy means that the place was, the city, the polis, was run by every citizen. That doesn't mean every human, that doesn't mean every person, or even every adult in the city, but every citizen of the place had an equal say in how the city was supposed to be run. There were certain times that monarchs or tyrants would have been in charge. We'll talk about some of those things a little bit later down the line. But if you were a citizen of one of these Greek city-states, then you had a right to weigh in on how you wanted things, how you wanted your city to be run. You could cast a black stone of negation or a white stone of affirmation, and you could decide if you wanted to, declare war on this other city-state or this, group of barbarians. You could decide if you wanted public money spent on this or that public affair or this or that public work. You could decide to join or leave a defensive alliance. And people, one of the reasons that this was able to work so well for the Greeks when it would not have worked out well for a lot of other people is because of one of the other things that we tend to associate with the Greek people, and that would be the idea of the phalanx, the fighting formation. The phalanx was a shield wall, a wall of men with these spears that were protruding out of it. The armor so these men were called hoplites. The armor that they were expected to wear weighed 70 pounds altogether, and the shield itself weighed 18 pounds. So we are clocking in 88 pounds of gear that these people would have been expected to be able to march effectively and efficiently into battle with and to fight carrying. And so one of the things I think is interesting is sometimes you'll see an artistic display or something where you'll see these hoplites and their breastplate has like abdominal muscles and pectoral muscles that have been shaped into it and carved into it. And I used to think, oh, that's so ridiculous. But no, they actually did that. Like I said, these were worshipers of the human form. and they had perfected a certain physique underneath their breastplate, and they wanted to make sure that that was also communicated to the enemy. They thought of the human form as being able to evoke a sense of awe or fear in the opponent. But you didn't just want to wear it on the outside, you also wanted to have achieved that underneath. And so these men were expected to hold their shield in front of themselves and their neighbor. And so because of that, they had a common amount of skin in the game when it came to these battles, and that meant that they trusted each other. They had shared heritage. Citizenship was usually, if not always, conferred by bloodline. They had a shared stake in the battles whenever they would fight next to each other. And because of that, whenever they cast their lot, whenever they cast their vote for a certain matter, they had certain social structures in place that would have caused them to weigh more heavily the needs of their brothers, because these are the brothers who are going to be defending me in battle. These are the brothers whom I'm going to be defending in battle. And so because of that, a lot of people think, including me, that it's because of that democracy worked out a lot better for the Greeks than it may have been able to in other places. Another thing that the Greeks had in common was an affinity for the Olympic Games. The Olympic Games themselves were thought of as an act of worship that happened at the foot of Mount Olympus once every 4 years. They thought they divided their own history into these 4-year sections that they called Olympiads, and they respected it. They took it very, very seriously, so much so that even if two city-states were at war with each other, they would put that war on pause. No Greeks were allowed to fight other Greeks from 1 month before the Olympic Games started to 1 month after they were over. So not only the Olympics themselves were held in respect, but also people would be able to travel freely by boat or by land to be able to make it to the games. Because if you were able to win an event at the Olympic Games, you would bring great honor and great prestige to your patron or patroness god. And a lot of these same events that they would have participated in are still in the Olympic Games today, from different distances of running. They had wrestling, what they called pancration at the time. Pan means all, and kratos means strength, so all forms of strength used in pancration, kind of a form of MMA, you can think of it. The discus, the javelin. You also had the chariot races. Interestingly enough, if a certain horse won the race, the driver was not considered to be the one who would get the reward. It was the breeder and the owner of the horse who would receive the wreath, the crown. There were no cash prizes or anything like that, but if you went home with a wreath that you had won from the Olympics, you would probably eat for free for the rest of your life. People would, you'd be a man of renown, and you would be considered to have gained great glory for your god or your goddess and your entire city. Because remember, it's not for another 4 years that other cities would have an opportunity to try to steal that honor or to take that honor for themselves from you. So you have the aesthetic, you have the language, you have the social and political ideas that come from the polis, you have the Olympic Games, and then you also have what is probably one of the first things that people think of when they think of the Greeks, which is their mythology, their set of gods. So kind of like with the Egyptians, perhaps I'm an Egyptian who lives in a city where our patron goddess is Isis, but you live in another city in Egypt. That doesn't mean that I don't believe that your god is real. I'm just more concerned with honoring my patron goddess than your patron god or goddess. And it's the same thing with the Greeks. Even if I lived in Athens and my patroness would have been Athena, I don't believe that your gods aren't real. I'm just more concerned with bringing honor and glory and prestige to the name of Athena than to the name of any of the other gods. So you have the 12 Olympic gods who are supposed to have lived at the top of Mount Olympus. Zeus, who would have been the king of the gods and the god of the sky and weather. You have Poseidon, who's the god of the sea, but also, interestingly enough, the god of horses. You have Athena, who's the goddess of war. You can think of more in the realm of strategy or the use of clever tactics in war. She's also the goddess of wisdom. That's what most people know her as. Ares, who we usually think of as the god of war, and he is the god of war, but more when it comes to rage and bloodlust and things like that, this desire for valor in the way that you fight in war. You have Artemis, who is the god of the moon and of the hunt and wildlife. You have Hermes, who is the messenger god. He's the fastest of the gods. This is where we get the idea of the winged sandals of Hermes. Hera, who is the wife of Zeus and also the goddess of the hearth and home, motherhood, and family. Demeter, who is the goddess of the harvest, of crops, agriculture. Hephaestus, who is the god of metalworking, metallurgy. Apollo, who is the god of the sun and also art, poetry, music, things like that. Dionysus, who is the god of wine and drunkenness and partying. And then Aphrodite, who is the goddess of beauty and romantic love. Another one of the gods, very famous, but obviously not an Olympian. He doesn't live on Mount Olympus, would be Hades. He doesn't live there. He lives in Hades. He lives in the underworld with his three-headed hellhound Cerberus, who serves to guard the gates to the underworld. And then you didn't just have gods, but you also had demigods and mortal heroes. So demi means half. A lot of these guys were half gods. So you can think of Heracles, who's known usually better by his Roman name, Hercules, from the Disney movie. That's where a lot of people would get their ideas of him from. You have Perseus, another famous hero who he's actually the one who has the winged sandals and the Pegasus, and he cuts off the head of the Gorgon Medusa and saves the princess Andromeda. You have Achilles, who is one of the heroes of the Iliad, the story of the Iliad, completely impervious to any type of wound other than on his foot, his heel, his Achilles heel. And then you also have Odysseus, who is probably one of the lesser known of the Greek heroes for most of us today, but he would have been absolutely one of the most consequential and well-known heroes to the ancient Greeks, and it's because of his preeminence in the two most important stories that shaped Greek culture, the Iliad, and then the second one that's actually named after Odysseus, the Odyssey. The Iliad is the story of the Trojan War, a war where the Mycenaean Greeks went to war against the Trojans, also Greeks. And interestingly enough, for a lot of these tales, a lot of the mythology, the Greeks hearkened back to what they called the Age of Heroes or the Age of Legends. This could have been them cobbling together different stories that had taken place during the Dark Ages, or perhaps even before that in the Bronze Age. But the Trojan War goes on for 10 years, and the Greeks are not able to penetrate the walls of Troy. And so it's actually Odysseus who comes up with this clever strategy of building a wooden horse as a false gift of surrender, sneaking some men inside, and then leaving it for the Trojans to bring inside. Why a horse? Well, interestingly enough, the patron god of Troy was Poseidon. And remember that he's not only the god of the sea, he's the god of horses. And so they build this wooden horse. They fill it with Greek troops. The Trojans accept it, believing that the Greeks have the Mycenaean Greeks have surrendered. They bring the horse inside. They drink. They party. They get drunk. They pass out. And while they're drunk and asleep, the Greeks sneak out. They unlock and open the gates, and the Mycenaean Greeks come in and slaughter the Trojans. And that's the story of the Iliad. Remember that just the story of the Iliad alone lasts for 10 years. That's the story of the Trojan War. So by the time the war is over, Odysseus and his men have already been away from home for a decade. And the story of the Odyssey takes an additional decade just for him to be able to make it home from Troy, where the Trojan War had happened, to Ithaca. So Odysseus is the king of Ithaca. And his wife and his son Telemachus and his dog are all waiting for him there. And the story is largely about Odysseus, but two other of the main characters would have been the god Poseidon and the goddess Athena. Athena is a sponsor of Odysseus. She has respect for him. He used a clever tactic in battle, and he was able to secure a victory because of that. But Poseidon, because he has defeated his sponsored city of Troy, and to add insult to injury, a horse as a wooden horse is a false gift of surrender. Poseidon really detests Odysseus and wants to destroy him, wants to keep him from being able to make it home. He encounters various different perils along the way. He and his men land on the island of the Cyclops, and they wind up trapped in his cave, and they have to blind him in order to escape. And just to add more reason for Poseidon to hate him, it turns out that this Cyclops is one of the children of Poseidon, and so he redoubles his efforts to keep Odysseus from being able to return home. You also have the sirens, who are said to have such beautiful singing voices that they lure the ships of men toward the crags and the rocks of the shore of the land that they live on, and the ships are dashed upon the rocks, and the sirens feast on the flesh of the men, Odysseus is able to have his men strap him to the center mast of the ship, while they stuff their ears with beeswax and row past, so that he's able to hear the sound without falling prey to it. You also have the witch Circe. They land on her island, and she turns his men into animals, many of them into pigs for some reason, and Odysseus has to convince her to change them back. The twin monsters of Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla is this seven-headed sea dragon, and then Charybdis is a monstrous whirlpool, and he has to sail between these, and he has to actually offer 7 of his men to the 7 heads of the sea monster. And then finally, the place where he spends most of his time is on the island of another witch named Calypso. And by this point, all of his men have perished, have died, and only he survives. And Calypso captures him and holds him on her island for, I believe, 8 of the 10 years of this story take place. He's only on her island, and she is trying to get him to fall in love with her, but he is loyal to his wife, and he just wants to get home to his wife and his son and his dog. And eventually, after he's been on her island for years and years, Athena finally implores Zeus and convinces him to be able to force Calypso to release him from her island. And so with that, he's able to return home to Ithaca. But when he gets to Ithaca, he finds that his wife has been being accosted by a lot of the different men in Ithaca. He gets there, and the men are trying to tell his wife, look, he's obviously dead. He's been gone for 20 years. There's no way that you should still be holding off hope. And they've broken into Odysseus's house, and they're drinking his wine, and they're partying, and they're brawling, and they're breaking things, and they're just making a mess of it, very chaotic. And these men know that if they can convince the queen to marry one of them, that he will become the king of Ithaca. And Odysseus disguises himself with the help of Athena, and he goes back onto the island of Ithaca. And interestingly enough, kind of a bittersweet moment, his dog is really the only one who's able to recognize him through the disguise, and is so elated and overjoyed that he, leaps toward him, but the joy seems to be too much for him, and the dog actually dies in that moment. So this dog is over 20 years old at this point, though, so he's had a good long life, but he's so overjoyed to see his true master return home that he actually dies from it. And so Odysseus tells his wife, who doesn't know that it's him, says, well, you want to marry a man who is like Odysseus. So I know that Odysseus has this bow that's very difficult to string. So how about you make it where any man who can string the bow and fire it through a series of arrowheads, he gets to be your husband. And she says, you know what? That's smart. I've been waiting for 20 years. It makes sense for me to go ahead and, put the men to a challenge like this. Odysseus is able to string the bow and fire it through the arrowheads, and he is, because of that, he secures his wife's hand in marriage, and then he disposes of the suitors, either through killing a lot of them, or some of them are chased away, run away. But Odysseus assumes his rightful place on the throne of Ithaca, with his wife and his son Telemachus by his side, and presumably his dog buried in his backyard with honors. But that's the story of the Odyssey, and the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey would have been as central and as critical to the psyche, the psychology, the culture of Greece as the Bible would be to modern, or maybe we should say pre-modern civilization, as the myth of Horus would be to Egyptian civilization, or the Epic of Gilgamesh to Sumerian civilization. These stories would have communicated to the Greeks, this is what the gods are like. They can be bargained with, they can be enraged, they can be assuaged, they can be convinced of certain things. So you want the gods on your side. This is where they got their ideas of masculinity and of virtue, and even of how to properly navigate your way through different social interactions with people. A lot of that would have harkened back to the concept of the concepts that were found in the twin stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so all of these are layers that are cast over each other for what it would have meant to have been Greek. So the Greek language, the Greek aesthetic, the Greek social and political ideas that come from the polis, the affinity for the Olympic Games, and perhaps most importantly, their religion, their mythology. All of these things, it wouldn't matter if you were a Spartan or an Athenian or a Theban or a Corinthian or any of these other, whatever city you were from. While you might have had rivalries with certain other Greek city-states, you would have found yourself united with them in all of these things, and you certainly would have thought more highly of them than you would have thought of, let's say, the Persians or the barbarians or any other supposed group of people. So that's kind of our introduction for what Greek culture was like, what it meant to be Greek. I'm going to focus more on specific episodes of Greek history, the Greco-Persian Wars. We'll talk about Alexander the Great, but I wanted to spend all of this time kind of just laying the groundwork for what it meant to them to be Greek, so that we understand this going forward. Because, like I said, this is the first layer of the creation of what we would call Western civilization. You have Greek culture, and then over top of that would have been Roman culture and civilization. Over top of that would have been the largest, and I would say, most influential, most important layer, which would be Christianity. You also have Germanic identity that's plastered over that, and all of these things in their interactions with each other would have created this thing called Western civilization. So if we want to understand that, this is where we start. So thank you for watching. I know this has been a longer video than usual, but I'll see you next time, and I hope you have a blessed day.